The cool evening air settled over the dimly lit gas station on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Keanu Reeves pulled into the lot, his motorcycle humming beneath him as he slowed to a stop beside one of the pumps. He removed his helmet, running a hand through his slightly disheveled hair, and took a deep breath. It had been a long day, and the solitude of the road had been a welcome escape. As he reached for the fuel nozzle, his sharp eyes caught sight of a man sitting on the curb near the station's convenience store. The man looked worn, both in body and spirit. His military jacket, faded and frayed at the edges, clung to his thin frame. His boots, scuffed and barely holding together, rested on the cracked pavement. He sat hunched over, his fingers tightly gripping a paper cup that barely had anything in it. A small, tattered duffel bag lay beside him, it seemed stretched to the point of bursting. His face, partially hidden beneath a scruffy beard, held an expression of quiet defeat. Keanu watched him for a moment, debating whether to approach. He had encountered people in need before, and he always made an effort to help in whatever way he could. But there was something about this man, something different. It wasn't just the look of struggle, it was the way he stared into nothing, the way his body sagged with exhaustion, as if he had been carrying a weight far heavier than his duffel bag for too long. As he finished refueling his bike, he made up his mind. Pocketing his wallet, he took a slow step toward the man, who didn't even lift his head as Keanu neared. "Hey, man," Keanu said gently. "You doing okay?" The veteran barely reacted. His fingers tightened around the cup, as if bracing himself for something. Keanu crouched down to his level, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm Keanu," he said, though he didn't expect the man to recognize him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the man finally turned his head slightly, his tired eyes flickering with the faintest trace of awareness. His voice, hoarse from either disuse or exhaustion, came out as a whisper. "David," he muttered. Keanu nodded. "Nice to meet you, David." Another long pause followed. David seemed hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether Keanu's presence was a kindness or a threat. It was a reaction Keanu had seen before in people who had been let down too many times. He glanced at the paper cup in David's hands, noticing it held no more than a few dimes and pennies. "You hungry?" Keanu asked. David hesitated, his pride warring with his need. He gave a half-hearted shrug, as if the answer didn't matter, but his sunken cheeks and weary expression told a different story. "Come on," Keanu said, nodding toward the convenience store. "Let me grab you something." David didn't move at first. But after a few seconds, as if surrendering to the inevitable, he slowly pushed himself to his feet. Keanu noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way his shoulders sagged under the invisible burden he carried. They walked toward the store in silence, the only sound between them the faint hum of cars passing on the nearby highway. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights cast an artificial glow over the rows of snack foods and refrigerated drinks. Keanu let David take the lead, watching as the man hesitated near a rack of prepackaged sandwiches. He picked up one, then set it back down, as if even that small decision was too much. "Get whatever you want," Keanu encouraged. David swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. Then, cautiously, he picked up a turkey sandwich, a small bag of chips, and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but Keanu could tell it was more than David had allowed himself in a while. They approached the counter, and Keanu paid for the items without hesitation. The cashier barely glanced up, used to transactions that didn't involve much conversation. David muttered a quiet thanks as Keanu handed him the bag. They stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying the scent of distant rain. David walked back to his spot by the curb, settling down with slow, deliberate movements. Keanu remained standing for a moment before lowering himself down beside him. "You been out here long?" Keanu asked after a few moments of silence. David tore open the sandwich wrapper but didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "A while," he admitted. Feels like forever. Keanu nodded, sensing there was more to the story. He wasn't one to pry, but he also knew that sometimes people just needed someone willing to listen. You a veteran? Keanu asked, gesturing toward the jacket. David gave a short, humorless chuckle. Yeah, he said, taking a bite of the sandwich. Not that it means much now. Keanu remained quiet, letting the words hang between them. He had met many veterans over the years, and he knew that coming home wasn't always the end of their battles. For some, it was just the beginning of a different kind of war, one fought against memories, loss, and a world that had moved on without them. David chewed slowly, as if savoring the food more than just for its taste. Keanu could see the way his fingers trembled slightly, the way his eyes darted to his bag every now and then, as if afraid someone might take what little he had. You got a place to stay? Keanu asked gently. David stiffened, his jaw tightening. Here and there, he said vaguely. Shelters when I can. Street when I can't. Keanu exhaled softly. He had known the answer before he even asked, but hearing it confirmed made his chest ache. For a while, neither of them spoke. David finished his sandwich in slow, deliberate bites, drinking the water in small sips as if trying to make it last. Keanu watched the passing cars, his mind turning over the situation. He had stopped here for gas. Just a simple, routine errand. But now, sitting beside a man who had been forgotten by the world, he felt the weight of something bigger pressing down on him. He couldn't just walk away. David set the empty sandwich wrapper aside and wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked at Keanu for the first time with something resembling curiosity. Why were you doing this? He asked, his voice carrying a hint of suspicion. Guys like me, people don't usually stop. Keanu met his gaze, his expression soft but steady. Because I can, he said simply. And because everyone deserves a second chance. David scoffed, shaking his head. Second chances don't come easy. No, Keanu agreed. But sometimes, they come when you least expect them. David didn't say anything. But for the first time since Keanu had approached him, his posture relaxed, just a little. Keanu knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. In fact, something told him it was just the beginning. The night deepened, and the steady hum of cars passing on the nearby highway filled the silence between them. The gas station lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Keanu remained seated beside David, neither man in a hurry to leave. The air carried a slight chill, but Keanu barely noticed. His mind was preoccupied with the man next to him, the way David's eyes remained guarded, the way his hands fidgeted even when at rest, the way his shoulders carried a weight unseen yet undeniable. David shifted slightly, pulling his duffel bag closer. The small movement did not go unnoticed by Keanu, who recognized it as an instinctual reaction, one born from too much time spent with too little security. You got family? Keanu asked after a while, his voice calm and unassuming. David exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the empty water bottle. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer, but then his voice came, low and rough. Had, he muttered. Once. Keanu didn't press. He understood that some wounds didn't need immediate prodding. But David surprised him by continuing. My wife left a few years after I got back. Couldn't deal with me anymore. His laugh was humorless, barely more than a breath. Can't blame her, really. Keanu tilted his head slightly. What happened? David ran a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion and regret evident even in the dim light. I came home, but I wasn't really home, you know. I thought I could just slide back into the life I left. Thought everything would be the same. But it wasn't. I wasn't. He shook his head. I tried to make it work, but the nightmares, the panic, he stopped himself, inhaling deeply before releasing a slow, measured breath. She tried. She really did. But after a while, she just stopped. Keanu could hear the ache in his voice, the way each word carried the weight of memories that refused to fade. He had met many people in his life, but there was something about David that struck a deeper chord. David leaned back against the metal wall of the gas station, his gaze fixed on the darkened sky above. "I had a kid too," he murmured. "A daughter. She was 5 when I deployed. By the time I got back, she barely knew me." Keanu remained silent, allowing David the space to share as much, or as little, as he wanted. "I tried to be a good father. Tried to reconnect. But kids, they pick up on things. She could tell something was off with me. I could see it in the way she looked at me." He swallowed hard. "I scared her once. I didn't mean to, but it happened. After that, things were never the same." The weight of his words settled between them, thick and heavy. Keanu had no rehearsed words of comfort, no empty platitudes to offer. He had always believed in action over words, in presence over speeches. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to push away the thoughts. "I bounced around after that. Tried to hold down a job, but, let's just say employers aren't too patient with guys like me." He gestured vaguely toward himself, as if his very existence was proof of his struggles. "One thing led to another, and here I am." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "How long have you been on the streets?" David hesitated before answering. "A little over 3 years." His voice was laced with something between shame and resignation. "I keep thinking I'll turn things around. Get back on my feet. But every time I try, something knocks me down again." Keanu understood that kind of struggle, not in the same way, but enough to recognize the exhaustion in David's voice. He had met many people who had fought their own demons, and he knew how relentless those battles could be. The gas station remained quiet, the occasional rumble of a car engine breaking the stillness. Keanu's gaze drifted toward the convenience store, then back to David. He knew offering a meal was a small gesture, but it wasn't enough. "You want a fresh start?" Keanu asked, his voice steady but gentle. David let out a dry chuckle. "Who doesn't? I mean a real one," Keanu clarified. "A chance to get back on your feet. No gimmicks. No strings." David turned to him then, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" Keanu met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I can help." David scoffed, shaking his head. "People don't just help for no reason." Keanu let out a small smile. "Maybe they should." David studied him for a long moment. The skepticism in his eyes was understandable, life had likely taught him that kindness always came with a price. But Keanu wasn't offering charity. He was offering something deeper, a belief in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that one moment of kindness could shift the course of someone's life. "I don't have much to offer," David admitted finally. Keanu shrugged. "You don't have to." Another silence stretched between them. David's fingers tapped lightly against his knee, his mind visibly working through the offer. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "What are you proposing?" Keanu leaned forward slightly. "For starters, a place to stay. A roof over your head. A chance to get stable." David's jaw tightened. "I don't need a handout." Keanu nodded, respecting the pride beneath the words. "It's not a handout. It's a chance. You take it or you don't. No pressure." David rubbed a hand over his face, considering. The idea of a warm bed, a safe space, it was almost too much to process. But there was still a part of him that resisted, that feared hoping for something only to have it ripped away. Keanu seemed to sense his hesitation. "Just think about it," he said. "No rush. No expectations." David sighed, staring down at the worn pavement beneath them. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't dared to in years, uncertain hope. Keanu stood, brushing off his jeans. "I'll be around," he said. "If you change your mind." David remained seated, watching as Keanu walked toward his motorcycle. The engine rumbled to life, but Keanu didn't pull away immediately. He glanced back once, giving David a small nod before finally riding off into the night. David sat there long after Keanu had gone, the empty food wrapper beside him, the offer lingering in his mind. He had spent years believing he was beyond saving, beyond second chances. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't so sure. David sat on the curb long after Keanu had ridden away, the dull ache in his legs barely registering as he stared at the empty road ahead. The sound of the motorcycle had faded into the night, leaving him alone once again. He was used to that feeling. Solitude had become more of a companion than a burden over the years. And yet, something felt different this time. The encounter with Keanu had stirred something in him, something he had long buried beneath layers of disappointment and resignation. He glanced down at his hands, still gripping the empty water bottle. The offer replayed in his mind. A place to stay. A fresh start. No strings attached. He had heard similar promises before, mostly from well-meaning strangers or organizations that ultimately led to dead ends. People who wanted to help but didn't understand what came next. Help was easy to offer. Sustaining that help. That was a different story. His stomach growled, reminding him that, for the first time in days, he had eaten something more than scraps or whatever he could scrounge up. He leaned back against the cool concrete of the gas station wall and closed his eyes, letting the night air settle over him. He told himself he wouldn't dwell on it. He had survived this long on his own. He would keep going, like he always did. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The following morning, the world moved around him as if he weren't even there. He had grown used to being invisible, people passing by without so much as a glance, as if he were just another part of the city's forgotten landscape. He shuffled into the convenience store to wash up as best as he could in the tiny restroom, splashing cold water on his face and running damp fingers through his unkempt hair. He avoided his reflection in the mirror. He knew what he looked like, tired, worn, and barely recognizable as the man he used to be. Stepping back outside, he adjusted his duffel bag over his shoulder. His next move was uncertain. The shelters were usually full, and even if he could get in, the rules made it difficult to stay for long. The streets were familiar, but they were getting harder. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and the exhaustion settled deeper with each passing day. He wasn't sure what made him do it, but his feet carried him in the direction Keanu had gone the night before. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the simple fact that no one had spoken to him like that in a long time, not with pity, but with genuine kindness. Whatever the reason, he walked. Hours passed as he wandered through the city, lost in his own thoughts. He didn't have Keanu's number. No way of contacting him. And truthfully, he wasn't even sure if the offer had been real or just something said in the moment. But a part of him, a part he had tried to silence for years, wanted to believe it was real. It was early afternoon when he found himself sitting on a park bench, watching people pass by. A young mother pushed a stroller, laughing softly as her toddler babbled excitedly about something only he understood. A businessman hurried past, his phone pressed to his ear, too wrapped up in his conversation to notice anything around him. A group of teenagers sat on the grass, their carefree laughter ringing through the air. David used to be a part of the world. He used to have a life, responsibilities, people who cared about him. Now, he was just a bystander, watching life move on without him. He was about to get up when he heard the familiar rumble of a motorcycle. His head turned instinctively, and sure enough, Keanu pulled up near the park entrance. He wasn't wearing his helmet this time, and his expression was calm, as if he had expected to find David there all along. David stiffened, debating whether to leave before Keanu spotted him. But it was too late. Their eyes met, and instead of surprise, Keanu simply smiled. "Glad I found you," Keanu said as he approached, hands in his pockets. David let out a dry chuckle. "You were looking for me?" Keanu nodded. "Figured you might still be around." David studied him carefully, searching for any sign of obligation or guilt, some indication that Keanu was only doing this because he felt sorry for him. But all he saw was sincerity. Keanu gestured toward a small cafe across the street. "You hungry?" David hesitated. He could have said no. Could have walked away, gone back to the life he knew. But something about the way Keanu asked made it hard to refuse. "Yeah," he admitted finally. "I could eat." The cafe was warm, filled with the rich aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread. The woman behind the counter greeted Keanu with a smile, clearly recognizing him, but she didn't make a fuss. He ordered 2 plates of food and motioned for David to sit at one of the corner tables. The meal was simple, eggs, toast, and bacon, but to David, it felt like a feast. He ate slowly, trying not to let his hunger show, but Keanu noticed. "No rush," Keanu said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Eat as much as you want." David nodded, focusing on his plate. After a while, he set his fork down and looked across the table. "So what's your deal?" he asked, his voice lighter than before. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "My deal?" David gestured vaguely. "You're a movie star. You've got money. You could be anywhere, doing anything. So why are you here, buying breakfast for some guy you barely know?" Keanu leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "Not in the exact same way, but I know what it's like to lose people. To feel like the world has moved on without you." David studied him, waiting for him to continue. Keanu sighed, his expression turning more serious. "I lost my best friend years ago. Then my daughter. Then her mother. All within a short time." His fingers tapped lightly against his coffee cup. "There was a time when I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. Like nothing made sense anymore." David frowned. He had heard bits and pieces about Keanu's past, but hearing it directly from him was different. "How'd you get through it?" David asked. Keanu shrugged. "One day at a time." David nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Keanu set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. "I meant what I said last night. If you want a fresh start, I can help." David looked down at his hands. The offer still felt too big, too good to be real. But as he sat there, across from a man who had faced his own losses and still found a way forward, he felt something stir inside him. A sliver of hope. He exhaled slowly, then looked Keanu in the eyes. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a shot." Keanu smiled. "Good." And for the first time in years, David felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. The road stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar, as Keanu's motorcycle hummed steadily beneath them. David sat behind him, gripping the sides of his seat, not quite comfortable, but not entirely uneasy either. The weight of his duffel bag pressed against his back, a reminder that, for the first time in years, he wasn't walking the streets with nowhere to go. He wasn't sure where they were headed, but strangely, he didn't feel the same resistance he once would have. The city faded behind them, its towering buildings and chaotic streets replaced by quieter roads, lined with trees that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The crisp air filled David's lungs, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself take in the moment without immediately trying to figure out what came next. He hadn't expected to say yes. Even as the words left his mouth back at the cafe, part of him wanted to take them back. But something in Keanu's eyes made him trust the offer, even if he still wasn't sure why. Keanu had barely spoken since they left, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. He had a way of making things feel normal, even when nothing about the situation was. David had spent so much time around people who either ignored him or saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved. Keanu didn't look at him that way. And maybe that's why he stayed. After nearly an hour on the road, Keanu slowed the bike, pulling off onto a smaller road that led to a quiet property tucked behind a stretch of tall pines. The house was modest, not overly flashy or extravagant, but there was something inviting about it. A long driveway curved toward a garage, and beyond that, a porch wrapped around the front of the house. It wasn't a mansion, but it wasn't small either. Keanu shut off the engine and swung his leg over the bike. David hesitated before following suit, taking a slow step forward, unsure of whether he should. "This your place?" David asked, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. Keanu nodded, pulling off his jacket. "One of them. I spend most of my time in the city, but I come here when I need to get away." He gestured toward the house. "Figured it'd be a good place for you to reset." David took in the surroundings, the quiet, the space, the smell of fresh earth that wasn't tainted by exhaust fumes and garbage. It was peaceful in a way he hadn't felt in years. Keanu led the way up the steps and unlocked the door, pushing it open. The inside was just as simple as the outside. Warm wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with bookshelves. There was nothing about the place that screamed celebrity. It felt lived in, familiar, like a place meant for healing rather than show. Keanu kicked off his boots and motioned for David to follow him down a hallway. He stopped at a door and pushed it open, revealing a guest room with a neatly made bed, a small dresser, and a window that overlooked the trees outside. "It's yours," Keanu said. "For as long as you need." David stepped inside, unsure of how to react. He hadn't slept in a proper bed in years. Even when he had managed to find shelter, it had never been more than a cot or a mattress on the floor. He ran a hand over the blanket, grounding himself in the reality of it. "This feels weird," David admitted, his voice quieter than before. Keanu leaned against the doorway. "Yeah. It'll take time." David set his duffel down but didn't sit. He didn't know what to do with himself. The weight of everything settled in his chest, gratitude, hesitation, the lingering instinct to run before he got too comfortable. "You don't have to figure everything out today," Keanu added, sensing the unease. "Just rest." David exhaled slowly and gave a small nod. "All right." Keanu patted the doorframe. "Bathrooms down the hall. I'll get you some fresh clothes." David watched as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress give slightly beneath his weight. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process how he had gone from sitting outside a gas station to being here. After a few moments, Keanu returned with a set of clothes, comfortable sweats, a t-shirt, and a hoodie. He set them on the dresser without comment. "You hungry?" Keanu asked. David hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I could eat." Keanu smirked. "Good answer." They moved to the kitchen, where Keanu pulled out ingredients with an ease that suggested he actually enjoyed cooking. Within minutes, the scent of sizzling garlic and onions filled the air as he worked over the stove. David sat at the table, watching. It had been a long time since he'd sat in a kitchen that felt like home. He didn't know what to say, so he settled for watching Keanu move, comfortable in his own space, unbothered by the silence. "Why are you doing this?" David asked after a while. Keanu didn't pause what he was doing. "Because I can." David frowned slightly. "That's not really an answer." Keanu stirred the pan, then glanced over. "When I was at my lowest, someone helped me. No questions, no expectations. Just kindness." He turned off the stove and started plating the food. "I'm just passing it forward." David absorbed the words, unsure of how to respond. Keanu set a plate in front of him, pasta with chicken, fresh vegetables, and a side of bread. A simple meal, but to David, it felt like a luxury. As he picked up his fork, something in his chest tightened, not out of sadness, but out of something dangerously close to hope. "Thanks," he said quietly. Keanu simply nodded. "Eat." David did. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had long thought impossible. Safe. David awoke to the sound of birds outside his window, their soft melodies filtering through the glass like a gentle reminder that morning had arrived. It took him a moment to register where he was. The bed beneath him was real. The warmth of the blanket wrapped around his body wasn't a dream. He wasn't on a cold sidewalk or tucked in a cramped corner of some alley. He was here, in Keanu Reeves' guest room, in a house that felt more like a sanctuary than anything he had known in years. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It had been a long time since he had slept this well, and yet, the weight of the unknown pressed against his chest. What now? The fear of overstaying his welcome crept into his mind. Was today the day Keanu would sit him down and say, "All right, that's enough. Time to move on"? The thought sent a wave of anxiety through him, but before he could dwell on it too much, the smell of coffee and something frying in the kitchen reached him. He pulled himself out of bed, stretching his sore limbs before heading down the hallway. Keanu was already at the stove, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, flipping pancakes with the kind of practiced ease that made it clear he did this often. A fresh pot of coffee sat on the counter, along with a plate of scrambled eggs and crispy bacon. "Morning," Keanu said without looking up. David hesitated in the doorway. "Morning. Hope you like pancakes," Keanu added, setting another one on the growing stack. "Figured you could use a real breakfast." David's stomach growled in response, but he still felt that hesitation, that instinct to not get too comfortable. He sat at the table as Keanu brought over 2 plates, then poured coffee into 2 mugs before taking a seat across from him. David picked up his fork, pushing the food around for a moment before finally taking a bite. It was warm, filling, better than anything he had eaten in months. He chewed slowly, still adjusting to the fact that he didn't have to rush through meals as if someone might take them away. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Keanu leaned back in his chair, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "So," he said casually, "what's the plan?" David stiffened slightly, his instincts screaming that this was the moment. This was where Keanu would lay out the conditions, tell him what was expected, or worse, suggest it was time for him to figure things out on his own. David hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know." Keanu nodded as if that response didn't surprise him. "That's okay." David blinked. "It is?" Keanu smirked. "Yeah. No one expects you to have it all figured out overnight." He sipped his coffee before continuing. "But I do think it might help to have a starting point. Something to work toward." David exhaled slowly, setting his fork down. "I don't even know where to begin." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "What did you do before?" David ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "I was a mechanic. Back before everything." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You like working with cars?" David shrugged. "Yeah. It made sense to me. Machines break, you fix them. Simple." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "You ever think about getting back into it?" David let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, sure. Let me just pull a job out of thin air." Keanu didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You're not as stuck as you think you are." David frowned. "That easy, huh?" Keanu shook his head. "Not easy. But not impossible." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Look, I'm not gonna pretend like I know exactly what you've been through. But I do know that once you stop believing in possibilities, you stop moving forward. David sighed, staring down at his plate. Keanu continued, his voice steady. I have a friend. Owns a small garage a few towns over. He's always looking for good people. I could introduce you. David looked up sharply. Just like that? Keanu shrugged. Just like that. David didn't know what to say. It felt too easy, too surreal. I'm not asking for anything in return, Keanu added, sensing his hesitation. No catch. Just an opportunity. David wanted to believe it was that simple. But years of disappointment had conditioned him to be skeptical. What if I screw it up? Keanu's expression didn't change. Then you try again. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wanted to argue, to point out all the ways this could go wrong. But a small, stubborn part of him, the part that hadn't completely given up, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it could go right. After a long silence, he finally nodded. All right. Keanu smiled. All right. The conversation shifted after that, moving to lighter topics. Keanu told him stories about his own experiences working on motorcycles, about the time he nearly wrecked his first bike because he hadn't tightened the bolts properly. David found himself chuckling, the tension easing just a little. By the time they finished breakfast, the weight on David's chest wasn't gone, but it felt a little lighter. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The engine hummed softly beneath them as Keanu's motorcycle cut through the open road. The wind rushed past, cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. David sat behind Keanu, gripping the seat with one hand, his other clutching his duffel bag against his side. It had been years since he had traveled anywhere with purpose, years since he had gone anywhere that felt like it might lead to something real. He had spent the morning trying to convince himself that this was a mistake. That taking Keanu up on his offer, meeting some garage owner who might or might not want to hire him, was just another setup for disappointment. But despite the doubts gnawing at the back of his mind, he had still climbed onto the motorcycle when Keanu had tossed him a helmet and said, "Let's go." Now, with the city fading behind them and the landscape opening into rolling fields and quiet roads, David felt something strange, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Possibility. Keanu barely spoke as they rode, letting the journey stretch out in silence. It was a quiet that David appreciated. He had met plenty of people who felt the need to fill every empty space with words, but Keanu wasn't like that. He let things be, let the world exist without trying to mold it into something more comfortable. After nearly an hour, Keanu slowed the bike and turned onto a smaller road that wound its way through a quiet industrial area. They passed a few small warehouses, a vacant lot overgrown with weeds, and finally, a modest-looking garage with a rusted sign that read, Mason's Auto. Keanu pulled into the gravel lot and killed the engine, swinging his leg over the bike with ease. David hesitated before following, his boots crunching against the loose stones. "This is the place?" David asked, scanning the garage. It was nothing fancy, just a large, metal building with two open bay doors revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, the scent of motor oil and grease filled the air, mingling with the faint hint of burnt rubber. Keanu nodded. "Yeah. Mason's been in the business forever. He's good people." David exhaled sharply, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. He wasn't sure if he believed that. Most people weren't good people, not in his experience. Before he could talk himself out of it, a man emerged from inside, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He was stocky, maybe in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a face that had seen its share of hard years. His eyes flicked to Keanu first, then settled on David with quiet scrutiny. Keanu smiled. "Mason. This is David. The guy I told you about." Mason grunted, tucking the rag into his back pocket. "That so?" He looked David up and down, not with judgment, but with the kind of assessment a man gives when he's trying to decide if something will hold up under pressure. David held his ground. He had been sized up by plenty of men before. Keanu clapped Mason on the shoulder. He's got experience. Used to be a mechanic. Figured you could use an extra set of hands. Mason crossed his arms. That right? David nodded. Yeah. Mason exhaled through his nose. You any good? David hesitated. It had been years since he had worked in a shop, but he had been good once. His hands still remembered the work, even if his confidence didn't. I know my way around an engine, he said. Mason squinted at him for a long moment before jerking his chin toward the garage. All right. Show me. David blinked. Now. Mason shrugged. No time like the present. Keanu grinned, stepping back as Mason led David into the garage. Inside, a beat-up old truck sat on one of the lifts, its hood propped open. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and the tools were scattered across the workbenches in a way that spoke of a place that had seen years of hard labor. Mason grabbed a wrench and handed it to David. She's been knocking bad. You tell me why. David hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. The moment his fingers curled around the wrench, something shifted inside him. Muscle memory took over, old instincts kicking in as he leaned over the engine. He listened, felt the metal, traced the problem like he had done 100 times before in his past life. He worked in silence for a few minutes, adjusting things here and there before finally straightening up. Piston slap, he said simply. Probably worn cylinder walls. Could be bad wrist pins, but I'd bet it's the cylinders. Mason arched an eyebrow. Yeah. David nodded. Yeah. You can replace the pistons, but unless you fix the cylinder wear, it's just gonna happen again. Mason huffed out a breath, looking mildly impressed. Not bad. He turned to Keanu. You didn't bring me a complete idiot. Keanu smirked. I told you. Mason studied David for another long moment before jerking his thumb toward the tool chest. All right. Grab a socket set. Let's see if you can do more than just diagnose. David didn't hesitate this time. He moved toward the tools, grabbing what he needed without fumbling, without second-guessing. The weight of the socket wrench in his hand was familiar, comforting. As he got to work, Keanu leaned against the wall, watching quietly. He didn't say anything, didn't interfere. But when David caught his eye for the briefest second, there was something there, something like quiet encouragement. For the first time in years, David felt something stir deep in his chest. Purpose. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed through the garage as David tightened the last bolt. His hands, once unsteady from years of neglect and uncertainty, moved with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Grease streaked his forearms, and sweat dripped from his brow, but he hardly noticed. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was lost in the work, completely absorbed, muscles moving on instinct, mind focused on solving problems instead of dwelling on the past. Mason stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, observing with his usual unreadable expression. The old mechanic had barely spoken since David had started working on the truck, offering only a grunt here and there when necessary. David didn't mind. He was used to people watching him, judging him. But this time felt different. Keanu sat on a stool near the entrance, sipping from a water bottle. He hadn't left since they arrived, letting David take this moment without interference. He was just there, a silent presence, a quiet reassurance. David finished the last adjustment and stepped back, wiping his hands on an old rag. That should do it. Mason raised an eyebrow. You sure? David nodded. Start it up. Mason eyed him for a second longer before moving to the driver's seat. He turned the key, and the truck rumbled to life. The engine, once plagued by a persistent knocking sound, now purred with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Mason let it idle for a moment, listening, feeling. Then he shut it off and stepped out, giving David a slow nod. "Not bad," he muttered. David exhaled, only now realizing how much tension he had been holding. It was a small thing, a simple fix, but to him, it felt like proof. Proof that he still had something to offer. Mason wiped his hands on his jeans and turned to Keanu. "You vouch for this guy?" Keanu nodded without hesitation. "I do." Mason considered that for a moment, then looked back at David. "All right. You want a job, it's yours." David froze. He had spent so long drifting, so long being rejected, ignored, cast aside. He wasn't sure he had even let himself believe this was possible. "You serious?" he asked, half expecting Mason to take it back. Mason snorted. "I don't waste time on jokes. You work hard, you get paid. You screw around, you're gone. Simple as that." David swallowed hard. This was real. A job. Stability. A chance. "I won't screw around," he said. Mason smirked. "Good." Keanu clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "Told you." David let out a breath that almost felt like a laugh. He shook his head. "Yeah. Guess you did." Mason pulled a notepad from his back pocket and scribbled something down. "Be here at 7 tomorrow morning. We start early." David took the paper and nodded. "I'll be here." Mason gave a grunt of approval before disappearing into the back of the garage. David stared at the note in his hand, the weight of it settling in his chest. He had a job. A real one. Something to build from. Keanu stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching him with a knowing smile. "How's it feel?" David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Weird." Keanu chuckled. "Yeah. Good weird, though." David nodded. "Yeah. Good weird." They left the garage as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The ride back was quieter, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that had filled David's life before. It wasn't the empty, aching quiet of isolation. It was the silence of possibility, of something new taking root. When they pulled up to the house, Keanu parked the bike and stretched. David climbed off, feeling the exhaustion settle into his muscles, but it was the good kind, the kind that came from a hard day's work instead of endless wandering. As they stepped inside, Keanu headed straight for the kitchen, pulling 2 beers from the fridge. He tossed one to David, who caught it clumsily. "To new beginnings," Keanu said, twisting off the cap. David hesitated for only a moment before doing the same. He clinked his bottle lightly against Keanu's. "To new beginnings," he echoed. They drank in comfortable silence, the weight of the day settling over them. For the first time in years, David didn't feel like he was just surviving. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living.